Do we know how this works? I'm new. It's like magic. Or not. Well, I don't think we're women. SS Carol. Okay. Well, I'm going to forego finding this. There are handouts with PowerPoints, and I will speak to them. They look like this. They're green, if folks have them. Share with a neighbor if you'd like. And I just want to thank Lynn very much, because I'm inspired by the work that AARP has been doing around articulating what patient-centered care should really be. And I've been using the brief that was passed around and helping develop some more of Compassion and Choices programs as we continue to grow in response to what is the tremendous need that we're experiencing from both people and their families as they face the end of life. We are a service provider as well as advocates, and I think the greater attention that's being brought also by organizations like CTAC and the Energy that Andrew is going to speak to, I think, energy being brought to kind of advanced illness, terminal illness, and care at the end of life is a discussion that's happening for two reasons. One is providers are being required to have it because of the situations that they're facing on the ground, and as Lynn pointed out, patients and their family members, persons and their family members are being required to have this because it's happening to them. I'm experiencing it with my mother right now, and I'm an advocate, and I have to go through all of the same situations that other people go through in trying to determine what exactly is going on with Mom. I need to understand what's happening in this system. I need to be able to be a good advocate. I need to be able to be a good caretaker. And most of us never assumed that we would be in this role. Compassion and Choices, here we are, a national nonprofit organization with a proven record of success in counseling clients and of protecting and expanding the rights of patients and their families, particularly at the end of life. We advocate strongly on behalf of persons with advanced and terminal illness. We've been doing so for 30 years to ensure that healthcare providers respect their wishes, whether their choice is to receive curative treatment, palliative care, or to refuse unnecessary life-prolonging care. So I'm going to be speaking today a little bit more about what happens when it goes wrong and what we're trying to do to both achieve what Lynn describes, which is kind of the ideal scenario of the integration of this family care system with a healthcare system, and where the translation often needs to occur for those two systems to function effectively together. Now, just to, there's been a lot of big numbers thrown around about it, like how old we're all going to get, and our lifetimes are going to extend. So far, no one has told me yet that we aren't going to die at some point. Still, it looks like that's going to happen to most of us. So part of that is embracing and understanding that that's going to happen, and being able to be willing to accept that that might be an option as a part of advanced illness or as a part of advanced care when we're looking at it. So we too believe language matters and believe that it's important to speak of the full range of what happens at the end of life, including death. Now, we got involved in this at Compassion and Choices 10 years in a more outspoken way about 10 years ago with Margaret Furlong, who was an 82-year-old woman who had debilitating rheumatoid arthritis, congestive heart failure. She had filled out 4 different advance directive documents and was papered up, as we like to call it, before she was transferred to a hospital by her daughter-in-law because she had an illness. That night, her heart stopped, and she stopped breathing, and she really should have been allowed to die. Instead, what ended up happening was absolutely every treatment that could be provided was provided to Margaret Furlong for the next 10 days, until eventually her son was able to advocate on her behalf to have all of the treatments removed. And she did that finally over a phone call after having spent many, many hours in the hospital. He went home for a moment to get some more documents and come back, and he made a phone call and finally got the hospital to actually remove the treatment. And they did that prior to him actually being able to return to the hospital. So Margaret died alone in the hospital room by herself without even her family members being with her in that process. So this has galvanized us for the last 10 years, and now we're getting quite open about it. Over the last 2 years, we've started something called our Unwanted Treatment Campaign. And this was brought about because the California court that eventually decided on the Furlong decision said this wasn't about the fact that treatment wasn't provided, it was about the fact that the treatment was unwanted and unnecessary in our mind, is kind of equal to that concept. So the Furlong case was a very clear-cut example of unwanted treatment. But we recognize that Compassionate Choices, through our consultation practice, that things aren't always that clear-cut. And that there's a lot of things happening, and a lot of really well-meaning, well-intentioned, knowledgeable people trying to provide the best possible care that they can in a situation under a broad set of variables and a big system that makes it quite difficult. So we sometimes feel a little bit like David and Goliath looking at our little group, which is about 60,000 folks across the country. We have about 70 staff people and hundreds of volunteers in about 13 locations. But even with that, we feel kind of small by comparison to the whole system that we feel like we're trying to advocate with on behalf of our clients. But even having said that, we recognize that it's not a clear advocacy message, and that the decisions that are happening within that patient-centered circle are complex and difficult. And often we refer to ourselves as the translator. I was sitting with the rabbi yesterday who was using that very terminology in being able to describe what he does at the bedside, in being able to converse with what a family member wants versus what the healthcare system wants or believes should be necessary. I often am reminded, I grew up on Peanuts, Snoopy, remember Snoopy and the Peanuts gang? I'm often reminded that when we engage in our consultation service that it sounds, the experience that patients, their family members, and doctors have on the ground is that experience that the Peanuts gang had whenever they were speaking to an adult. It was kind of like, wah, 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 maybe dying. Wah, 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 wah. If we don't, wah, 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 will you say yes? Yes. Okay, yes. And then the process begins. So sometimes this isn't that clear. Sometimes the idea of informed consent happens, but is it really informed? And if the system isn't designed to be around patients from the very beginning through this whole process, by the time you get to the want, 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 want conversation, because of the crisis that the family is in, it's virtually impossible to expect that informed consent can occur. So we have to step back from that and really do what AARP is discussing and advocating for, and changing the system around patient-centered care. Now, in terms of unwanted care, there's a study recently shown in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, done by Joan Tenno. I don't know if anyone follows her work, but it's really interesting stuff. And basically from 2000 to 2009, treatment in acute care hospitals decreased, but the usage of the ICU increased, as did healthcare transitions, moving people between institutions, which is very important when it comes to patient or person-centered care in the last month of life. And the usage of hospice, good news, the usage of hospice actually increased, right? That's the good news. Bad news, it's basically 3 days or less in terms of the usage. So that's the bad news. Now, our end-of-life consultation program actually works with people for about, the average is about 150 days. So hospice, we need to increase that usage. Can't just be the last place people go before, or after all of the treatment happens and before they die. It's got to be more than that. It's got to take into a broader consideration of what's happening at the end of life. Now we're dedicated, we're dedicated to the full range of medical treatments being freely available to patients. So this isn't about death panels. This isn't about rationing care. This isn't about palliative versus curative versus end-of-life care or, you know, advancing the time of death or whatever that might be for a terminally ill person. This is about people being able to experience and live their lives fully throughout the entire days of their lives, often with the knowledge of knowing that they will have control over the final days of their lives, which is a very different situation than what we have primarily on the ground happening now. So we are also trying to improve the quality of the discussions, just like was recommended by AARP, for patients and their healthcare professionals. And one of the things that Compassion and Choices did in California and New York was pass patient-centered consultation acts, which were really acts that required providers to have the full range of end-of-life conversation with their patients. This was called the California Right to Know Bill in California, and has a different, longer name in New York. And then Compassion and Choices several years ago around the Affordable Care Act tried to have the same conversation federally and get those conversations reimbursed by Medicare and Medicaid. And given the political climate, it was one of the hot button issues and ended up getting jettisoned. It looks like we might actually see a return of that conversation, hopefully with a far better, more civil discourse around the needs of folks this coming year, and we hope to see that happening. There does seem to be some movement on that. But in addition to some of those pieces, we want to ensure compliance with advanced directives in this paperwork that happens. And for that, this means that there need to be kind of carrots and sticks, both incentives, financial and otherwise, for healthcare institutions to honor advanced directives and PULSE and the contemporaneous decision-making of healthcare surrogates, and hopefully have a way for that decision-making to comply with what the patient wants and not necessarily with what the surrogate wants, or at least there's some reconciliation of that conversation. I spent some time with doctors and medical providers, and I often ask the question of how many of you actually read your patients' advanced directives? And about half of the room will raise their hands. And then I'll say, how many of you read about who the healthcare surrogate is or know who the healthcare surrogate is? And everybody's hand stays up. And some of the folks whose hands were up, were down, go back up because they may not have read the advanced directives, but they know who the surrogate is. And then I say, how many of you actually have read the wishes of the patient portion of the advanced directive? And it's nearly zero. So that's just my anecdotal evidence. We're not a research agency, but the reality of people knowing and understanding what patients want is something that we need to be better at putting into a system of care that gets acknowledged and gets read and gets appropriately incorporated into the experience. There could be some sticks around this too. I mean, CMS could look at ways of not reimbursing unwanted medical treatment that is not in compliance with the advanced directive. Margaret Furlong's care was paid by you, the taxpayers, through Social Security, through Medicare and Medicaid services, and that happens repeatedly across the country. Additionally, you know, the CMS has done some really cool things lately. I don't know if people have seen the nursing directives, the nursing home directives, but there are some other things that could happen around honoring advanced directives. There could be things like checkoff boxes in pre-admission forms, ensuring that doctors and patients understand that unwanted medical treatment would not be covered by a CMS reimbursement. So there are some hard things that could happen that could be easily implemented, some hard skills, hard tasks that could be easily implemented to help with this advancing the carrots and the sticks for trying to end unwanted treatment. At our grassroots, we're really trying to help people understand what their constitutional rights are at the end of life. And there are way more of them than people recognize and understand, as well as the Patient Self-Determination Act and what that means and the carrots and sticks around that. We ask our constituents and our mobilizers to educate people around their advanced directives. That's a huge program for us, is getting people into the system of not only having those those papers done, but having those express your values and having all of that be part of your surrogacy, part of the environment, that patient-centered care, and everyone knowing what those are. And then, petitions and unwanted medical treatments within community center settings, trying to discussions of that and conversations of that in community settings. We are also collecting stories of unwanted treatment and are compiling all of those into an anthology or a series of reports so that we can put a visual face on this as a vehicle for getting CMS, federal agencies, private payer insurance companies to understand the importance of the role that they play in actually encouraging unwanted treatment sometimes to happen, and the face of what that means needs to be brought forward. So we are collecting those stories, and if any of you have stories or if you know of people, they can go to our website at www.compassionatechoices.org and submit those stories and be a part of that experience. And I'm just going to leave it there and see whether you want to move on.